I'm Laura Lucas Magnuson, and this is The World Unpacked.
So happening in just the past few minutes, China's national parliament has approved a controversial national security law for Hong Kong.
The national security law says anyone can be arrested and jailed who organizes, plans, commits, or participates in any action that calls for separating Hong Kong from China or undermining national unification, who provokes by unlawful means hatred of Beijing, who directly or indirectly receives instructions, control, funding, or other kinds of support from a foreign country. And it could apply to anyone visiting Hong Kong.
Thousands of people took to the streets today in protest. Police confronted them with water cannon, tear gas, and pepper spray. About 400 people were arrested. Protesters say the law...
I'm just curious, how people can fight back and resist in this environment.
Shibani Mahtani is the Hong Kong bureau chief for The Washington Post.
Obviously, there was a few weeks where people were walking around absolutely shell-shocked, right? Like an anvil had just dropped on them, and it was really kind of surreal. I mean, people weren't really talking about it. People were sort of taking down kind of pro-democracy signs, slogans, icons, from their restaurants and from their shops. But, people weren't talking about how shocked and scared they were, but you could see they were. And I think over time, it's going to move and evolve into, okay, this is here to stay. This is our new normal. And how do we figure out a path forward? How do we fight? How do we resist?
In June 2020, Beijing passed a new far-reaching national security law for Hong Kong. Among other things, the law levies harsh punishments for secession, subversion of the government, and collusion with foreign powers. It also tightens government oversight of media outlets, private companies, and NGOs. And it creates parallel law enforcement and judicial channels in the city that answer to Beijing. Shibani, what aspects of the law do Hong Kongers find most troubling? What do you see as most significant?
Yeah, so I think that question is really difficult to answer because so many aspects of it have been so deeply concerning to Hong Kong people and every institution that operates in the city. But I think, we can start by the way the law was passed and enacted itself. Many Hong Kong people found out about this law while Beijing's top political body was having their yearly sort of annual meeting. And rumors started coming out that national security would be discussed. It was very opaque, as things often are in mainland China. And all of a sudden, the media was rushing around to talk to the few Hong Kong delegates in Beijing to understand quite what was happening. There was no preparation. There was no briefing. There was no discussion in the legislature. There was no sort of warning from Hong Kong's chief executive that there would be this coming. It was just rumors out of Beijing that obviously later became much more concrete and became much more real. Obviously, since 2003, a national security law has been something kind of hanging over Hong Kong's head. According to the basic law, which is Hong Kong's mini constitution, it has to be passed in some way or another. What happened in this case, that Beijing and Hong Kong officials have said it publicly, is that Beijing did not trust that Hong Kong's own legislative and legal processes would be able to see this through. So that's the way they did it. But, that gave the legislature, people who were elected, even, Hong Kong's government itself, very little room to actually debate it, to talk about it, to introduce it to the public. And I think that kind of really shocked people. And I think people are still kind of getting over the way in which this was enacted and enforced here. And then when the law itself was passed, almost no one in Hong Kong had seen any details of it, right? And went into effect after midnight on July 1. And when it did, members of the media were looking at, translations, official translations in Xinhua, the Chinese version of the law. And people were, I think, even more taken aback by the language in the law itself. For weeks, there were discussions on, okay, maybe this will just be a deterrent thing. Maybe this will be a sort of light touch law. They need to pass this national security thing. They need to do something in response to the protest. But the language itself was so far reaching, so broad and so harsh. And, with maximal penalties of life imprisonment for these 4 broadly defined crimes: terrorism, secession, subversion of state power, and foreign collusion, it really means that, anyone can get caught up by this, especially.
What was the most surprising part of that? You said people were taken aback by the extent of it. What were they expecting, and how was this different?
I think it was so catch-all because it even said stuff like somebody who's providing transport, resources, shelter, finances to somebody accused of those crimes can themselves be accused of that crime, right? Which would include, for example, an Uber driver picking up a protester home, from a protest last year. It was almost like they looked at every aspect of what they saw on the streets last year in Hong Kong, arson, occupying roads, stalling traffic, vandalism, and wrote the law around it. They wrote the law around what essentially they saw in the streets of Hong Kong last year. And so when you read it, you were like, wow, they really thought of every single aspect, like everything the protesters did last year, including, vandalizing the MTR, the subway system, was also considered to be an act of terrorism. So they made it so catch-all to kind of ensure that what we saw last year in the streets here in Hong Kong would not be repeated. And obviously, too, the whole thing about secret police being able to operate here in Hong Kong legally, that those institutions being set up to be completely separate from Hong Kong and its basic law and its common law system, the fact that judges would be appointed by the chief executive, who we all know is answerable to Beijing, and then the wide-ranging implications for the media, which I know we'll talk about in more detail later. I think, for every business, everybody operating here, every trader, accountant, everyone could be caught up by this, the way it's written. So I think really it's hard to pick out the most, I think, concerning element of it.
And we just have mentioned parallel structures, especially in terms of law enforcement. But let's talk more about what these laws mean for Hong Kong's historic relationship with China. What fundamentally changes beyond, obviously, more security control, which was important to Beijing?
So I think, Beijing's approach has been this sort of slow drip, death by 1,000 cuts kind of approach when it came to, slowly chipping away at Hong Kong's autonomy. I mean, we've seen, for years, moves to kind of limit the freedoms that are constitutionally protected here: freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom to stand on an anti-government platform and run for a position of power, like in the legislative council and so on. But we've seen that slowly be eroded, bit by bit. But this is a sort of bombshell that entirely changes the Beijing and Hong Kong relationship, right? It sort of says to everyone in Hong Kong, it doesn't matter what you do or what you oppose or what you want or what you don't want. If Beijing really wants something to be passed here, if it really wants something to be enacted, it's going to do it. It doesn't care about the Legislative Council, nor the Hong Kong government, nor the Executive Council, nor the Chief Executive, nor the people of Hong Kong. They're just going to do it. And I think that how the law was passed here, really was a very, very telling thing.
Yeah, as you just mentioned, before the law was passed, Hong Kongers probably had a sense that this was the direction that Beijing was going in, and yet Hong Kong had an election. So as you speak about what Hong Kongers want, what do you think the results of that election in November 2019 suggest?
Sure. November 2019, those were the local elections, district council elections that happened at a really interesting time here in Hong Kong. If you remember, it was right after the siege of 2 university campuses, the PolyU being the more famous one, because it was the scenes were really shocking. I mean, it was violent. It lasted more than a week. It involved thousands of students. And when we were watching Hong Kong kids, firebomb police vehicles, I think a lot of people were questioning, like, has this really just gone too far now, right? I mean, Hong Kong is a financial center where people have been peacefully protesting for generations, but this, like what we're seeing, is something else. And the district council elections came right after that. So right after the height, the most dramatic, the most violent point of the movement last year. And still, record turnout, people lining up around the block for hours and overwhelmingly voting in support of pro-democracy candidates, in support of the pro-democracy movement, and even voting for young unknowns in the early 20s who had posters of themselves with the yellow hard hat and the goggles that were, characteristic of the movement last year, right? They were not hiding who they were. They were not hiding who they represented and who they wanted to fight for. And those were still the candidates that overwhelmingly won. And, in speaking to a lot of the establishment and pro-Beijing folks here, they were totally caught off guard. I mean, I don't think they believed that could happen and that would be the response. For months before that, Beijing had, I think, really believed in the silent majority narrative that there would be, a lot of peace-loving, Hong Kong people, a lot of moderates who would come out and vote in favor of them and their candidates because they thought enough was enough and they were just being scared into submission by these radical young protesters. But that turned out not to be the case, right? And so, looking ahead, I think that was sort of a moment where we're like, okay, I think something's going to have to give here, because should the Legislative Council election happen this year, as was planned to happen, next month in September, I think it was quite clear that pro-democracy candidates would have had a majority of votes. Last year, they played such an integral role in going out to the front lines and protecting protesters and protecting even elderly people who were getting tear gas. And they're seen as like street fighters, right? They're not really seen as legislators anymore. And I think that's really sort of changed the way Hong Kong people look at it and look at the legislative process as a whole.
And we'll talk about elections in a minute. I wanted to go back to the protests that you mentioned, those mass protests of last summer and fall. Do pockets of protests continue now? What do you see on the ground in terms of public reaction to the recent law?
Yeah, so, even up to early this year, there were still people coming out in really, really large numbers here in Hong Kong. There was a large protest on January 1, New Year's Day. But since the onset of COVID-19, which obviously has changed things so fundamentally around the world, people stopped coming out, right? And that's when the momentum fundamentally sort of died a little bit. And I think once that happens, it's sort of really hard to get back. And we did see the protest movement again emerge at a few points right after the passage of the national, so right after, Beijing announced that they were going to pass the national security law, and again on July 1, which is the day that marks the handover of Hong Kong to mainland China. But things have definitely been much quieter on the protest front, right? And I think that's a twofold thing. I mean, I think that's a lot to do with COVID, but it's also, simply, people are scared. The national security law has been effective in that it has scared a lot of people from coming out. And also, the national security law and COVID-19 taken together mean that the police are now not issuing permits for protests anymore, right? I mean, what we saw last year, there was a mix of authorized protests, unauthorized protests. So it was a momentum that kept going. Some of it was happening above board, some of it wasn't. But this year, obviously, that's been impossible to get. Right now, social distancing measures in Hong Kong mean that if you're more than a group of two in a public place, you can get fined, and all of those are very real things for people to deal with, right? I speak to a lot of Hong Kong protesters who feel kind of lost. They don't really know how to fight back. They don't really know how to show their dissatisfaction. I mean, they're scared. A lot of people are leaving. But I don't think it's changed sort of the widespread sentiment on the ground, even though it's not as public, I guess.
We'll be right back in a moment to talk about how the national security law has been applied so far.
China extended its crackdown in Hong Kong today, arresting a prominent pro-democracy activist and media owner.
Confirming that Jimmy Lai has been arrested.
What can I do? Just keep quiet?
Shibani, several prominent Hong Kong residents have already been arrested for violating the national security law, including government critic and media tycoon Jimmy Lai. Tell us more about what his arrest means, both in terms of his alleged crime and expected punishment, but also about the future of press freedoms in Hong Kong.
Yeah, so when the national security law was passed, there was already widespread speculation of who would be among the first to be targeted under the new law. Names that came up frequently were Joshua Wong, the young activist who became famous in the umbrella movement in 2014 and 2015. But Jimmy Lai ranked quite high up simply because he's been a thorn in the side of the Communist Party for decades now. He essentially decided to channel his wealth into sort of pro-democracy causes after the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989, and him setting up Apple Daily and mixed media was part of that. And so Apple Daily, since the 90s, have been one of the most vocal critics of the Hong Kong government and the Chinese Communist Party, both inside mainland China and outside. And so, again, that there was speculation that Jimmy Lai would get caught up in this, particularly because he has such good relationships in Washington. Just last year, he visited with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. He's very close to Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi. He's sort of revered among people who've been watching China and watching the actions of the Communist Party, since Tiananmen, really. And so, when Jimmy Lai's arrest happened, I think people weren't so shocked by the arrest itself, but they were shocked by the fact that they also arrested both his sons, other executives at his media company, and then a few hours later essentially stormed the newsrooms of Apple Daily with 200 police officers. And I think that was the most shocking aspect of it. Not just that Jimmy Lai was taken, but he was taken along with all these other people, all these other activists, and that there were police officers telling journalists that they couldn't be in their own newsroom and cordoning them off from their own desks. And I think that was an aspect that was, to many people in the media, a sort of warning shot, a deliberate show of force to prove that, it doesn't matter that Hong Kong constitutionally has press freedoms. National security will trump everything else. And so if we do believe there's a reason to do this, we will do this. And really it was, the eyes of many journalists here and many people who care about press freedom, nothing short of intimidation, right? It was not just the fact that Jimmy Lai himself, was taken from his home and arrested. He's been arrested before, but they, paraded him through his own newsroom. And I think that was the most shocking aspect of it.
What, beyond shock, is the sentiment among journalists in Hong Kong? What are people watching closely to see sort of what's next or what this could mean for them?
Yeah, I think fundamentally, like the way we operate changed overnight with the national security law on so many aspects. The national security law basically now mandates that you have to turn over, notes, your documents, your servers, even as a publication or a tech company or a media outlet, if you are suspected of having information that could lead to arrest under the national security law or protecting somebody who is in violation of the national security law. And that's really broad and really sweeping. And it's something that, Hong Kong journalists never had to deal with before, right? And so all of a sudden, Apple Daily, but everyone else were having conversation about how to protect their sources, how to keep their notebooks safe, whether they should even have notebooks in the first place, how to delete files off the computer, where to store it, whether cloud service is safe, and had to have all those conversations very, very quickly in a way they never had to before. And I think, beyond that, from the foreign journalist perspective, we now also have the same concern as every journalist has in mainland China of how long can we stay? Will our visas and our ability to even be here become entirely politicized, right? I think there's some elements there that belong to the whole U.S.-China conversation, the tit for tat, and the kicking out of journalists in one place and it happening in the other place as a reciprocal decision. But I think the signs have already been made quite clear to us that you sort of better get in line, or you could be a target or subject to visa denials or delays or slow walking, right? And I think that is something that journalists in Hong Kong never had to deal with before. This is a city that has always hosted the regional hubs of every foreign outlet you can think of. The Wall Street Journal, New York Times, CNN, Bloomberg, Reuters, and I think that is something that everyone is having conversations about in their own newsrooms and figuring out how to take forward, because quite simply the risks of operating here have disproportionately sort of have exacerbated overnight.
You mentioned coronavirus earlier and the dampening effect on protests, as well as a delay in the election. So do you think coronavirus is being used in part to justify further anti-democratic action? And how does the decision to delay elections sort of play into the long-term strategy in Beijing?
Yeah, I mean, I think that COVID-19 really changed so much about the world, and we've written stories about this on a global perspective, but it's definitely sort of emboldened a lot of authoritarian behaviors and given cover for it and given an excuse for it in countries all around the world. And I think Hong Kong is no exception to that. When Carrie Lam announced a few weeks ago that she would be delaying the elections, it wasn't for 4 weeks like in New Zealand, it was for a year. I mean, that is a timeline that didn't seem to make sense to anyone. I think if she had said a month, 2 months, 3 months, we might be having a different conversation. But the fact that she said it was for a year really made people sort of question, the legitimacy of that delay and of COVID-19 being used as an excuse, right? I mean, I have no doubt that there are sort of public health concerns here as there are everywhere else, but no epidemiologist I spoke to said that there was a clear public health reason for doing this. Singapore notably had elections in the midst of COVID-19, and there was no evidence to show that there was a spike in cases or anything coming as a result of the election. Also, Hong Kong is one of the most wealthy and modern cities in the world. I mean, they could have spent a few months trying to think of alternate ways to do it, whether by mail-in ballots, online voting linked to your Hong Kong ID card, which is an electronic, access card anyway. There were different ways that this could have been handled rather than the outright delay, right? And so now what's happening in Hong Kong is that the previous legislative council is going to extend their term for another year, but the Democrats or the pro-democracy legislators in that council are now wondering whether they should even participate because they think it's become such a shambolic process and sort of eroded even the sort of fragments of democracy here. So yeah, I think COVID-19 has definitely changed the game here in a lot of ways, particularly with the restrictions on public gatherings. Even when rules were relaxed in Hong Kong, when we had almost no local transmission, they kept those caps, they kept those limits on gatherings, right? And, even when they were first introduced in, I think, March or April, I was speaking to diplomats who were skeptical that they were just there for the purposes of, COVID-19 and public health reasons, and were already then saying that, okay, I think these are going to stay for a long time, and I think they're going to be used to justify sort of crackdowns on people gathering, i.e. protests, right? So yeah, I think people here have extremely low trust in the Hong Kong government, and so everything that they say is sort of in the public health or public good is not really being perceived as such because of everything that's happened over the past year.
We'll be right back to talk about how these changes may impact Hong Kong's international stature.
Mr. Speaker, that if China continued down this path, we would introduce a new route for those with British national overseas status to enter the UK, granting them limited leave to remain with the ability to live and work in the UK and thereafter to apply for citizenship.
Carrie Lam, the chief executive of Hong Kong, as one of the individuals listed in the Office of Foreign Asset Controls as targeted by sanctions from the U.S. Treasury.
We must stand up and fight and to let Beijing know that we will never surrender. And today, more than 1,000 Hong Kongers gather on street again is the proof that we will fight back.
Shibani, you just mentioned diplomats and their reactions to these laws. What implications do the legal changes in Hong Kong have for the city's longtime reputation as a center for international trade and finance? And how are you seeing this play out among tech giants, major banks, and other international corporations?
Yeah, so I think it's a really interesting question because I think when Beijing and the Hong Kong government set about introducing this new national security law, one of the things they wanted to do was make sure that the business community companies, major banks, and everything that sort of makes Hong Kong the financial center it is, were not spooked. I think they explicitly wanted to sell this law as though there was a political aspect of it, and it was just that, and it was just about clamping down on the protests and targeting a quote-unquote very, very small number of people, and that the rest of Hong Kong will be able to continue as per normal. The moment the law was published, I think the intentions of that sort of went out of the window, because I think people read this and were like, wow, this is a big deal, and it means really scary things for every company and every institution in Hong Kong. The tech companies are among the most interesting and perhaps the most in the firing line, right? Because, in Hong Kong, as everywhere else in the world, Twitter, Facebook, Google, and apps like Signal, Telegram, and so on have essentially been used as organizing tools, right? Without all of those things, the protests would have looked very different last year. People often call Hong Kong the Silicon Valley of protests because it is where people are extremely creative in understanding how to organize, mobilize online, even elude the Hong Kong police through the use of the online world and forums and code names and so on. And obviously, authorities recognize that, right? And so this has put American tech companies in a very difficult position. Immediately, you saw all of them come out and say that they would be halting their data requests from the Hong Kong government and the Hong Kong police because they did not want to be caught up in, potential human rights violations, right? And that's a big deal for companies like Google and Facebook who have staff here in Hong Kong. And so if they, don't if they don't respond to a data request from the Hong Kong police on national security grounds, could they be in violation of the national security law itself? Could their staff face arrest? And that is a conversation that's unprecedented, right? Hong Kong, unlike mainland China, has always been an open place for these companies to operate, and all of a sudden it became a huge liability overnight. The fact that they even have offices in these places became a very scary thing for Google and Facebook, right? And so I think a lot of them have had to have very difficult conversations. I know companies who have shelved investments in Hong Kong, because of this. I know a number of companies who are thinking of slowly dwindling their staff here in Hong Kong because of this as well. The second aspect of this is the U.S., right? I mean, obviously, the U.S. has had a very strong, strident response to what's happening here in Hong Kong, which is actually, I think, backed by the Five Eyes countries like Japan and other countries. That are very alarmed by what China's doing. And so the U.S. was obviously the first to sanction 11 Hong Kong officials, including Carrie Lam, the chief executive. I think indications are that they won't be the last country to do this, and that perhaps we could see more to come, and that really does change the game here, right? All of a sudden, companies like Visa and MasterCard, banks like Bank of America, Citibank, all of whom have huge operations here, have to figure out who they can do business with, whose bank accounts they can open, and so on, right? So I think it's just a minefield for everyone right now. I was even talking to someone who represents, talking to a lawmaker who represents the accounting sector, and he was saying even accountants are worried because accountants now don't know that if they're auditing something, they're auditing someone potentially for sanctions, or looking at their holdings in Hong Kong and so on, and then what they've come up with is used against them by the U.S. Could they be seen as violating the national security law? It's just like it's a can of worms, and I think everyone's waiting to see if there will be any clarity on exactly how the law is going to be used, and what that means for the future of their operations here in Hong Kong.
In addition to the sanctions that you just mentioned that the U.S. levied, it also revoked Hong Kong's special status as a separate customs and travel territory apart from mainland China, and it also looks poised to suspend its extradition treaty with Hong Kong, as the UK and New Zealand already have done. And the UK government is going further, offering Hong Kong residents with British national overseas status, residency rights, and an eventual path to citizenship. You mentioned Five Eyes. Where has the international community been the most active so far in response here?
Yeah, I think that all of the countries you mentioned, Canada, the UK, the US, Australia, Germany, are looking for, safe harbor policy, looking at safe harbor policies and looking at ways to welcome sort of fleeing Hong Kong people to their countries. People are grateful for that, but they're also a little bit cynical about that because it does really impact, middle-class Hong Kong people who have the means and likely have dual citizenship already, and who were always able to kind of leave, right? I mean, Hong Kong is a very unequal society. There are people here who are very international and very wealthy, but there also are people here, a lot of them who are at the front lines of the protests last year, who are much younger and don't really have the means to kind of up and leave and start their life somewhere else. So while the activists and the movement in general have been very, very grateful for those types of policies and very receptive to them, including the move from the UK to allow British national overseas passport holders a path to residence, I think people want a lot more, and they want a lot more targeted specifically at the Hong Kong government and the Hong Kong police, which has always been their sort of focus or their rallying cry, right? Because obviously if a lot of pro-democracy people leave Hong Kong, a lot of the best and brightest leave Hong Kong, then that's not great for the future of the city itself, right? And, already China has been on a push to turn Hong Kong into quote unquote just another mainland city by sort of diluting the people, the number of Hong Kong people who are actually here, right? Slowly diluting their language, which is Cantonese versus Mandarin spoken in the mainland, and having, more and more immigrants come in from the mainland. So yeah, I mean, you're still hearing, from Hong Kong people that they want the UK, Australia, and others to sanction Hong Kong government officials to revoke their second passports, which a lot of people in the Hong Kong government still have and still hold, especially for their children. It's just like quite stunning how all of those things have changed overnight, right? I mean, again, Hong Kong is an international city, has always been a place where government officials, would send their kids to schools overseas and, would be quite international in their own travels and in their own footprint, which is quite different, I think, from Beijing and sort of Communist Party members, right? So, all of a sudden you're hearing calls and demands from Hong Kong people to the international community that a lot of these privileges and rights that they've had for a very long time, the Hong Kong government should be revoked. And people, I know were very happy, even if it was just a symbolic thing when the sanctions, were announced against Carrie Lam and the Hong Kong Police Commissioner and others, right? So I think they're hoping sort of for more of the same.
And you talked about the exodus and the impact on sort of Hong Kong's makeup, its culture. What also do you think it will mean for the protests themselves, this sort of brain drain?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very hard thing for a lot of Hong Kong activists to reckon with, and I think has been one of the most sort of emotional, stories I've done, in the sense that, like, when people talk to me about their decisions to leave, what motivated them, what the factors were on both ends. So like middle class people with kids and, who are overseas educated, and people on the younger end who left, very suddenly because they were arrested or they were facing rioting charges or so on. They really struggle with it, right? They really, they're not happy about it. They did not want this for themselves. Hong Kong is their home, and they care about it so deeply, and they're so emotional talking about it. And they could never imagine sort of being forced out. And I think that's a very difficult reality. I mean, a lot of them really want to stay in, and they really want to come back, but they just feel too afraid to do it in these circumstances, right? And they also, fear raising their kids in an environment where schools are going to start having, national education, propaganda education, and so on. And so, what this means for the movement, I think, I think it means that the Hong Kong diaspora will be far more active in organizing, in leading, sort of protests and in leading campaigns overseas, the same way, exiled, communities in Myanmar and in Tibet, and obviously the Uyghur community now in Xinjiang, or who have been forced out of Xinjiang, have been doing that for years. But I think that's exactly why the national security law was written in a way to apply to everyone, everywhere, all over the world. I mean, I think that was very targeted at what they knew was going to be a very active, in some cases very wealthy and very connected Hong Kong diaspora that would be able, to have meetings in Washington, that would be able to have meetings in London, and push for change from afar, right? And I think you're already seeing, there were warrants of arrest issued against prominent activists that have fled, including an American citizen, Sam Chu, who's long been an advocate for sanctions and who's long, pushed that on the Hill. And so yeah, I think that's something that Beijing's also really afraid of, right? Which is why that whole foreign collusion thing, one of the four outlawed crimes in the national security law has been one of those bandied about the most, and was what Jimmy Lai was charged with, right? Because I think that's fundamentally what they're still, really, really concerned about and really afraid of.
This whole discussion, it sounds like there's just a mad scramble to understand what this means, what the implications are, what's next. As a journalist, what are you looking to see in terms of what's next?
I mean, I'm sure Beijing and the Hong Kong government realize this, but nothing's really changed in terms of how people feel, right? I mean, if anything, people have become more disaffected, more, more sort of just disgusted with the actions of Beijing and the Chinese Communist Party, and more determined to fight for Hong Kong's identity, the preservation of its special status, the preservation of its culture, its language, its way of life, its way of being. And I'm just curious to see how they can actually do that in this environment. I mean, street protests are not really a viable option anymore. You see people fighting in any way they can. For example, when Jimmy Lai was arrested, Apple Daily stocks actually went up. They were trading at some point 1,000% higher because it became an act of resistance to stop buying shares in Apple Daily. The newspapers were sold out. People were lining up for them at 2 a.m., which is the time that they hit, 7-Eleven and other convenience stores. And when we tried to, see if there was any copies of the newspaper at, 9 a.m., 10 a.m. the next morning, I mean, it was gone. They were all sold out. And my phone was flooded with messages being like, did you get any Apple Dailies? Do you have a copy of the paper? I mean, do you know where I can find them? They're all gone. So people are just finding ways to resist, however they can, and I'm just curious to see how that continues.
Shibani, thanks so much.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Till next time. Thank you for listening to The World Unpacked, produced by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. We're grateful for your listen and eager for your feedback. We welcome your emails at podcasts@ceip.org. And please rate and review us on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can find me, Laura Lucas Magnuson, on Twitter, @Laura L. Magnuson. These discussions are only made possible by our wonderful team behind the pod. Our audio engineer is Tim Martin, and our executive producer is Maya Krishna Rogers. We'll see you next time.